Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Amongst this week's news items we have the end to the IARC debacle around aspartame, the likelihood that bird flu is causing a number of deaths for cats of all things in Poland, the further research into legitimacy of supplements and notably how purported botanical ingredients are not what you'll find in them. France has issued a list of preferred publishing outlets for academic articles, and self-healing metal, otherwise known as the Terminator. You can find these and other news items at the timestamps given below. Let's start with the World Health Organization, and specifically IARC within them, declaring that aspartame is possibly a carcinogen, that is, something that causes cancer. As we've already mentioned, the International Agency for Research on Cancer was going to publish their own monograph. This most certainly was not following the correct procedures, and it is something they were told to wait to publish until another organization within the World Health Organization had established harm. You can't have risk if there is no harm. This is fundamentally the same sort of issues around glyphosate. Generally speaking, it's thought that aspartame intake should be limited to less than 40 milligrams per kilogram of body weight, which is pretty much what you'll find most beverages will have. That is, you can consume many drinks containing aspartame before you approach that limit. However, this doesn't mean that there's not some risk, but at that point you have more worries than just aspartame. This leads to what IARC has done in their final monograph, or report as you may know it. That is, they looked at evidence from across the world and tried to analyze whether or not the data within it, particularly experimental data, animal studies and similar, found endangered from it. The evidence for this was extremely limited, and pretty much explicitly associated with liver cancer, but again, there's practically no data to speak of to substantiate this, both at human doses, and, importantly, doses people would actually be exposed to. To give some context to the danger you would be in if you were consuming artificially sweetened beverages, you would need to consume more than 14 standard cans of drink, or over 5 liters, each day to be able to hit the acceptable daily intake, and that's not even at the point where you're at risk yet. Yeah. You either have to be basically living on carbonated beverages that have been sweetened, or something there too, which for most places in the world is unlikely, barring arguably America. In health-related news that actually has merit to it, and should be noted, there is a greater risk at the moment that tens of thousands of children could be affected by measles, coming very soon to London. This is something that's been announced by the UK Health Security Agency, and it's all based on modelling, so again, take this with a considerable amount of salt, given that, well, first of all, it's a model, it may be subject to new variables that haven't come into play yet, and therefore have not been added to the model, but it's also trying to predict the future, based on what we know now, which, of course, predicting tomorrow's weather, the outcome of an election, or similar is something that only a fortune teller can do with any kind of reliability. But no, realistically, the issue here is that there is a significant decrease in the number of children who have been given the MMR vaccine, or the measles, mumps and rubella vaccine. And this is about 1 in 10 is not protected, so that's 90% have been given their shot. 90% is below the 95% threshold for herd immunity. As you can imagine, this is a concern, particularly given that you've had a increase of more than 100%, so you now have 128 this year versus just 54 last year cases of measles. Yeah. The other issue here is, well, Wakefield. Unfortunately, there is an age group of between 19 and 25 at the moment who were born in and or around the period where he had the most impact and therefore did not receive the MMR vaccine. This means there were individuals who did not get vaccinated, for measles particularly, although measles and mumps and rubella together are a problem, and as a result, they are the same age group likely to be impacted by this spread. So you have the very young, that's newborn infants, and those who are young children, and those who are between 19 and 25. Those two age groups are going to add further strain to the health service in the UK because 20 to 40% of those people will need hospitalisation. Further to that, about 1 to 2 in every 1,000 children who get measles will die from it. Further, there is a large number of those who have complications who will need care, and there are other issues that carry on further down the track from getting measles. So this is not just there's going to be a spike in the number of children who are sick, it's going to be a spike in the number of children and young adults who get sick, increased healthcare demands, and all sorts of other issues. In other pathogenic news, we have a sort of reversal of the situation you'll normally see. Normally, cats are killing birds, but in this case, birds are killing cats by using bird flu, and this is unusual. Bird flu, otherwise known as avian influenza, is a concern in a lot of cases, largely because it can jump to humans more readily than other forms of influenza. It normally goes from bird flu, swine flu, and then human flu, and once it gets to humans, it's often quite nasty. There have been a few scares to that effect. However, we're not seeing humans being affected right now. It's cats in Poland, and dozens of them have died. And this is unusual and interesting. Largely because, well, it's cats. Cats are assholes, but most people wouldn't wish flu on them, let alone death. The current theory, at least, is that it is likely that the cats who died somehow were exposed to wild birds that had been infected with this, which seems rather likely given the surprising number of animals cats will kill and prospectively eat that you don't know about, let alone the ones they bring back to you. Given that they also know that this particular strain of avian influenza is circulating in wild birds, it seems likely that that is the primary source of exposure. The good news, other than the fact that the asshole cats are being put in their place by birds, is that there aren't any human exposure cases yet, or at least no human infections from exposure. And this means we don't have to worry about an avian influenza strain jumping to humans from cats just yet. Next we have a case of, what is effectively medical malpractice. It's a push to not only encourage but facilitate hormones in those who are transitioning during pregnancy. This is in an effort to not follow the normalization of fetal outcomes. Yeah, this is not evidence-based, and this is certainly not under the principle of do no harm that just about all doctors should be following. The short version of this is that there is a push to continue to provide individuals who are receiving hormones as part of their transition and to support social justice while they're pregnant. And this is an issue, particularly during pregnancy. For example, a lot of the male hormones will downregulate the hormones involved in pregnancy, and this means the chances of a successful birth are much lower. The second and somewhat more significant concern is that the hormones given to the prospective mother are also going to have an effect on the prospective child, and often negatively so. That's all kind of horrifying, to be honest. But the kicker with all of this is that the people who have written the paper in the journal Qualitative Research in Health, as they are so want to do, aren't actually doctors. Yeah, nobody should be surprised. In fact, they're all either sociologists or enthusiasts. Yeah, this is why you don't let people who are doing social research touch medical journals. Particularly if they're going to name it a medical uncertainty in reproduction of the normal, decision-making around testosterone therapy in transgender pregnancy. It's quite obvious from that they don't understand either the biological processes of pregnancy, the physiological processes, or what impact hormones may have on these two. When the authors specifically state that both patients and providers tend to pursue precautionary, offspring-focused treatment approaches, you know you have a problem. That's because that is the whole point of having an OBGYN, obstetrician, or similar looking after you. The idea is to ensure mother and child come out healthy, well, and preferably without issues caused by the medical treatment they received. But no, they're pointing out that focusing on the offspring particularly, who's going to be most affected, and who will be affected as a secondary product of focusing on the mother's treatment is wrong somehow. Yeah. As much as spending forever ranting about the ridiculousness of the entire article might be entertaining, no, we'll move on to news that's just as terrible, but at least not as destructive. And it relates to the presence and quantity of the intended botanical ingredients in various supplements, but specifically focusing on those that are supposed to increase performance in sports. The short finding is that of 63 products that were examined, 6 did not contain at least one of the 5 ingredients that were meant to be in it. This led to 57 being analysed. Then of the 57 that were analysed, 40% did not contain the accessible amounts of the labelled ingredients. Then we have 6 of them, or 11%, contained just 10% of what it's supposed to have. 12% had at least something the FDA prohibited. Then we had other issues again. The most serious of these was that one of them contained 4 different prohibited ingredients by the FDA. This is not necessarily news. We've mentioned in past videos that supplements are a very poorly regulated industry, and in reality, anytime you have poor regulation, grifters are going to come in, try and feed on the lucrative businesses that could be made by minimizing costs and maximizing profits with unfounded claims of efficacy. And that's exactly what they've done here. They've either not used anywhere near as much of the purported ingredient, they've not used the ingredient at all, or they've added what are effectively illegal substances to presumably try and sell the product better somehow. This means that you're not getting what you think you're getting, and you may have very much unintended side effects, or more likely, the actual effect of whatever they have added to the supplement that you don't know about. Good research is one thing, but unfortunately all academics will at some point or other have problems with their research, whether that is getting funding for it, which is perhaps the most common, notably amongst mid and late career researchers, or for those in their early to mid career, getting it published. Less common is, well, concerns about your research integrity, but as a Stanford University president has found out, that's exactly what's happened. The Stanford University president has resigned in lieu of their, let's say, questionable conduct, and arguably research misconduct. Tassir Levine has said in a statement to students and staff that they will be resigning effective August 31st. And it follows a independent review that, although he didn't commit research misconduct, there were serious flaws, and at least 5 of these were in papers around brain development, in which he was the principal author. Now, principal author may not sound all that important. Normally it's the first author on the paper is the primary. Not always, however, but first author is the most prestigious position. You'll sometimes find that the last author is effectively the person funding it and the official person responsible for the paper. And that's more likely to be the case here. The reason that's important is that even though they're not the first author and therefore not the most, let's say, prestigious individual on the paper, they are the one who bears all the responsibility, and that means these serious flaws were his responsibility to find, address, and fix before publication. This has eventually led to a degree of responsibility being taken, with at least 3 of the papers being retracted and 2 having corrections issued. How much this responsibility is going to have an effect is, well, much more questionable, given that they are from between 1999 and 2001. Although he's stepping down from being president, he's not actually stepping away from the university, as he will continue to be a biology researcher focusing on neurobiology, which, given what's been seen so far, is a bit of a concern. Next we have the choice by France to effectively issue a list of preferred journal articles, although whether or not this is going to work is, well, up in the air. After extensive discussion at the Conference of Deans of Medicine and the National Council of Universities for Health Disciplines, a list of 3,400 preferred scientific journals for publishing was released. This preferred list is effectively two things. One, it's intended to try and prevent the issue of predatory journals, and second of all, to try and increase the amount of open access publications that are used. This will do, well, several things, but the most important will be that the research is more readily available, and that the money the French government provides for research will not be wasted by submitting it to journals that have absolutely no integrity and zero editing involved, meaning that you effectively pay to have your manuscript put online in a so-called journal. The list is effectively a preferred list, and it's not necessarily exhaustive, but it is generally preferred. If somebody was going to, say, step outside the list of preferred options, the groups have issued a set of criteria with about 20 items to help, let's say, ensure quality. Otherwise, it's going to be interesting to see how this works. Next we have fun news, or perhaps it'd be better to call it fungi news. The news focuses specifically on research into how fungi have found ways to live for an incredibly long time and basically avoid death for, well, up to centuries. As a general rule, fungi can be very sensitive to changes in their environment. For example, if some fungi in Australia don't get exposure to heat or the necessary dead trees from their bushfires, they simply won't work. In other cases, that same sort of extreme heat change can cause fungi to die. This instead more specifically focuses on something more akin to cancer within fungi, and notably how within the mycelia growth of the fungi, the growths that occur there don't accumulate mutations, and therefore don't affect the fungi colony in the long run. The work focused on not necessarily the mycelia itself in terms of how it might turn cancerous, rather how mutations within it might prevent reproduction of the fungi, and therefore prevent the next generation from growing. The simplified version of this is that within the spore portion of the mushroom, it needs to release two different parts of it. These two parts each carry half of the chromosomes needed for the fungus to reproduce properly. Just as it releases them, they bind together, and then they allow for new spores to start growing and create new mushrooms. If there is mutation, this does not happen, and as a result, you don't get new mushrooms growing. All you get is growth of those that are, well, mutated, which is bad for the mushroom's long-term health and survivability. The researchers indicate, although again it's not entirely or necessarily perfectly clear yet, that there is something of a testing process to check whether or not something like this is happening prior to the release of spores, and this allows them to basically prevent those from being released. The last news item we have for you this week is, well, the preface to the Terminator, and kind of terrifying if you think that's possible in the future. It's a self-healing metal, although it is kind of important to notice that the degree of self-healing of the metal is at a very small scale at this stage, so we are a long way off a reassembling Terminator once you've shot it with a 12 gauge. The short and simplified version of the experiment is that a tiny piece of platinum, about 40 nanometers thick, was pulled 200 times every second. This led to what are known as stress fractures or fatigue damage. These are small fractures that eventually build up over a long term and cause a lot of damage. The fractures were showing very quickly and very obviously, but once the stressor was removed, the fracture began to heal after about 40 minutes. By itself, this is great news, except then the damage started again in a different direction. So it started to heal itself, but it also started to show damage elsewhere. The research is useful in two ways, well, arguably three. The first is simply that this occurred at room temperature. That means you don't require massive input of energy to effectively heal the damage to the metal. for example, like welding does. Second is that it does at least vindicate earlier research that argued that this would happen. Third and finally, it does indicate circumstances under which it could occur in the wild, so to say. The big issue with it occurring in the wild is the presence of things like oxides and other molecules getting in the way, preventing the metals from interacting, and thereby self-healing through the metals coming close enough together that the atoms begin to effectively bleed into each other. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.